Can consciousness, subjective experience, be studied with the same mathematical rigor as physics?
Absolutely.
Explain
100%.
that, because that
Yeah.
doesn't seem
So
doesn't jive with me. It seems too strange. So explain it.
yeah. So I mean, this is very counterintuitive, but if you think about normal language, we use language to describe conscious experiences in more or less the same way that people used language to describe the quote unquote physical reality before they had the physics we have today. And so what happened then historically was that in the 16th century, Descartes came along, and of course there were lots of developments that led up to that. And he had this idea, well, couldn't we use, three coordinates for the three dimensions, to describe space with numbers? And this was a very powerful idea. It allowed us to describe the motions of object as functions suddenly. It allowed us to describe surfaces as functions. And it kind of brought this whole toolbox of mathematics into physics. And I think we're currently doing the same for consciousness, and we're not there yet, of course. There's lots of work to do. There's a rich history in psychophysics on the one hand, where we try to use mathematics to describe experiences or to describe the relation between stimuli and certain experience features. There's also other developments elsewhere, and I think the field is currently moving towards this. And of course, there are there are crucial questions, like questions you wouldn't have in the physical case so much. Questions like, what are truth conditions for using math to describe experience? But I think we're there, and I think in a certain sense it's going to be more exciting because it's very likely that the mathematics we need to use for experience is going to be more difficult, more complex, more involved, than the mathematics we can use for at least classical and quantum physics.
Really cool. It's a really good analogy. How formalizing something in a mathematical sense just gave us so much stronger intuitions about how to talk about the topic and how to maybe ask more nuanced questions about it. Can you kind of talk us through how you start building equations, how you start even thinking about maths of something like subjective experience? Because I think it's just such a
Mhm.
strange idea for people.
Yeah, I think it's mainly a strange idea because we're not really taught modern mathematics in school, right? Everyone thinks mathematics is about numbers, or you use the word equations, which is also, related to that. But modern mathematics is actually about structures and structures of structures and how structures relate to structures.
Mm.
And, this is precisely the angle we're taking with consciousness. So the idea is you can study the structures of your experience, both in the sense of like sort of the permanent, if you like, the atemporal structures. In the case of like color vision, that's what we're doing, but also the dynamic structures, the structures of lived experience. And structure is also maybe a strange word in that context. It is about structures, but I mean structures in the mathematical sense. So a better word would actually be just mathematics, the mathematics of lived experience. And we can describe that. And we can get that out of the lab, out of meditation practice, out of phenomenological analysis, where phenomenology is meant with a big P, the tradition going back to Husserl, among other people. And we can get that. And if we have this structure of conscious experience, even only partially, we can think about how this description, it's a description we're getting, right? A description of what we want to explain, namely conscious experiences. And we can then think about how these descriptions relate to physics, or the structure we have in physics, the structure we have in neuroscience, and we can start building theories. Theories of consciousness are basically just hypotheses about how conscious experience and the physical relate. And the physical really just means the subject matter of the other sciences, like independently of what metaphysics you decide to use. And we can do this in a structural way. And if we do, we hopefully we get theories that are more explanatory. They explain more than the theories we had in the past 20, 30 years. And they're hopefully also more predictive and therefore more easy to falsify.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, really cool. Like, I guess the main difference here is that if we were developing a equation to describe what it is like for me to
Mhm.
experience the color red, right?
Yeah.
And we're trying to build some generalized equation for that.
Mhm.
And then we have my experience of that. and there would be an equation for that, and then you have your experience of what it is like for red, for you
Yeah.
to experience red,
Yeah.
and it's likely
Yeah.
that, or it's actually 100% that those equations are not going to be matched in any way, right? My experience of red is certainly different than yours. We have different photoreceptor distributions
Absolutely.
in
Yeah.
that experience. We have,
Yeah.
all the times that I've
Yeah.
experienced red in the past, the types
Yeah.
of emotions that I
Yeah.
attribute to that color, the
Yeah.
tone, the vibe. Like, how
Yeah.
the hell do you encapsulate all of these
Yeah.
weird,
Yeah.
abstract, fuzzy concepts
Yeah.
in maths? This
Yeah.
is what I hope to
Absolutely.
really try and learn in this podcast, and what I hope
Yeah.
we can leave
Yeah.
the listener with some idea of.
Yeah. I think that there's sort of two ideas or two things, right? On the one hand, we don't have to go to the rich experience you're having right now. That's the dream, of course, ultimately. But we're very early in this field, consciousness science. And so when you're very early, you typically try to look for very simple systems or very simple examples. And historically, the first paradigm we had for the last 30 years was just binary things. We looked at having consciousness, not having consciousness, seeing a stimulus consciously, not seeing it. But we can now go to using these structural methods and mathematical phenomenology. We can go to better paradigms. We can go, for example, to paradigms where we study minimal experiences. These are not meant to be in any sense, binary distinctions, but their experiences. You can reach them, for example, through meditation, where people experience a deconstruction of almost everything that you and I experience right now.
Right.
It starts usually or often with the content. These experiences are to some extent contentless, but it goes much further. You can deconstruct a notion. By deconstruct, I mean you meditate and you experience time to resolve, yourself to resolve. The subject-object distinction even arguably resolves in some of these experiences. So we can go to experiences that are in a certain sense minimal. We have to think about, okay, what exactly do we mean? Which experiences exactly do we take? But these have the huge advantage that we can study them in a more easy way. So they're on the one hand easier to grasp, both in normal language and also in terms of mathematical language. But they are also, in a certain sense, or at least there are arguments that say maybe what we're experiencing then at the very end of these states, which you can usually only reach if you have a lot of meditation experience. And at the very end, we might be reaching what is essential about experience, So we're in this good situation where arguably, at least, we have things that are easier to model than the experience you have right now. And maybe they're more essential to understanding the problem or solving the problem of consciousness in the first place. So
Can,
that,
can you
yeah.
Sorry, can you give
Mhm.
an example of a conscious percept that you think we have quite well described mathematically? If we're not at the experience of red yet,
Mhm.
is there is there an example that we have you think formalized well?
So I have to sort of take there are two hats I can wear, right? And one hat is really, I think we've made enormous progress, even in very daily things like color experiences. We have 100 years of color science. We have color spaces that are extremely well understood. We have mathematical phenomenology. There isn't like a wealth of progress, but they're very good examples. We have a good understanding of what the mathematics of experienced phenomenal unity are, for example. So we have a lot of things that are good and good enough to work with. But I also have this other hat where I work on the foundations of all of these questions. What does it even mean to say that conscious experience has this and this mathematical structure? And then if I have this other hat, of course, I'm starting to be very critical. How much of the color space is really due to experience and as compared to mathematical convenience or laboratory structure. So, but generally speaking, I think we're in a very, very good situation. And personally, I think so. What always helps me to think, if I think about these questions, is color. Actually,
Mm.
color spaces. I don't know if this is the direction which you want to go with your question,
Please
but
go, yeah, please,
yeah,
if that's a good example, yeah.
yeah. But I would. So I mean, so I would say we have a pretty solid of an understanding. We understand, for example, what it means to say that conscious experience has a relative similarity structure of colors, and we understand to a reasonable degree what the corresponding space is or mathematical structure is that comes out in order to describe these experiences.
Can you explain
Yeah,
maybe what that means, what the corresponding space? When you use the word
yeah,
space there, what
yeah,
exactly do you mean?
yeah. So a space is, so I mean it in a mathematical sense. not in a physical sense. So it's not about 3D space. So the typical space we all learn in school is a vector space. It has 3 dimensions. It has additive structure. You can add, you can multiply. And a space is just a special case of a mathematical structure as understood in mathematical logic. So mathematical structures are in a certain sense more general than spaces. And there's actually in mathematics nowhere there's a very specific definition of what a mathematical structure is, but no definition of where a structure ends and a space starts. Spaces are just structures which have certain intuitive feelings. And in the case of color, for example, we can build a color space. And this is really, I should emphasize, this is work that has been done over decades. And we're just making use of that in consciousness science. It's not our achievement. And these color spaces, they work as follows. You have a space always has a certain, if you like, a bag of points. There's a set, it has elements, and the bag of points are color experiences. And so the idea is there's a point which represents your experience of red. And then there's a point which represents your experience of blue. And then in addition, the space has structure. And the structure could represent something like, for example, how close are two colors. That's represented by a metric function in the standard formulation of color spaces. And
What,
yeah.
what do you think intuitions of consciousness do you gain from, say, understanding these color spaces, understanding the structures? Is there an intuition that comes out from that?
I think so. I mean, there's a general intuition that leads to a specific philosophical hypothesis, and that is the intuition that perhaps all the structure there is sufficient to actually individuate the single color experience. But I think so. If I'm trying to I have a feeling about maybe what's the sort of thing that you have in mind and that you're worrying about, and that maybe you're thinking, or hopefully you're thinking that might not pan out. And let's see if that's true. It might be wrong, but so most people, when they think about these examples, there's this intuition that, look, I have this red experience, and it's something I can directly grasp. I have it immediately. And now there are these people, and they built these spaces around of it, where the space of all color experience, and it has structure. And how does it square? I don't think that when I experience red, I experience these structures necessarily. It seems to be a given.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think this is really on many people's minds. And all I can say is, on the one hand, there are specific philosophical hypotheses that might be true or wrong, which are trying to say that if you know all the structure, you know the experience, right? Or if you fix all the structure, you fix the experience. And this is super interesting because if you think according to these lines, you can think about the famous bat example, Thomas Nagel's what does it feel like to be a bat?
Yes.
And you could then think that, if only we could characterize the experience of the bat in terms of these mathematical structures, we could actually see if we can make you experience the same structure. This is not absurd. This is so at least a priori, this is very plausible. The mathematical structure of your auditive space is very complex. It's very high dimensional. And you could arguably find a way to actually make sure maybe you'd have to do a few things we wouldn't want to do in practice, like play around with your nerves a little bit. But in theory, at least, you could make sure that you have the same experience. And then you could know what it is like to be a bat in this particular instance. But this is only one hypothesis. And this hypothesis can be true or wrong. But independently of whether it's true or wrong, it is certainly, you increase your understanding by working with structure, I would argue.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. The bad example is interesting because one of the ways that I think about consciousness is as a control system, as a biological control system. So, of course, in that, part of bat consciousness will be controlling and regulating its wings. That's part of that consciousness. In the same way that part of our consciousness is regulating our fingers, our toes, our arms, our legs. That's sort of built into consciousness. So, it feels like that it would be extremely difficult or impossible for our brain to interpret the experience of a bat because we don't have wings. Do you understand what I mean? It's like that. That's like there's an implicit structure of that consciousness, and I might have used structure wrong in that sentence, but
right.
that is about wing regulation, maintaining and regulating the bat's wings that we just could never understand because we don't have wings. Do you think that's a solvable problem?
So I think I mean, for these structuralist accounts that we're discussing, this is a problem that is in principle solvable, I would say. The idea
Interesting.
is, so, I mean, okay, so there's a little bit more to unpack actually. So the
Yeah.
question is really, so I love this. This is the deep question, are our experiences private? And if
Yes.
so, can we do anything about this when we use math? And so the first thing I think we have to really face is that if I, let's say I study the bad very long and I'm in a future consciousness science where I can use some nice theory to actually get the structure of the bad's experience. For the sake of the argument, let's say completely. And now suppose I come on to your podcast in 20 years, you know, 15 million followers or more. And I just bring the structure. I say, look, Evan, here, I've written it down. Here's a slide or whatever. That's the structure of the bad's experience. And absolutely, you will basically learn nothing from that, even if you
Yeah.
understood all the math that was in there. So I think we have to step away from this idea in general, not only for mathematics, that we can just say some things and then someone else will understand the experience. So, but what we can do is we can use the structure to then do something to you to make you potentially have the same experience. So the structure is not so much the mathematical structure, and I think the same is true for language, by the way. It's not so much meant to like immediately give you the experience, but it's meant to be, it encodes information that we can make use to actually collate. That's a bad English word for a nice German word, to collate experiences over subjects, and thereby then also build theories about them.
So do you think we
Yeah.
could, if you could formalize all of that maths, you could upload it to my Neuralink chip that's in some part of my brain, and then that would, mimic that experience then?
In principle, depends on the chip, but in principle, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Maybe it's where you use the word collage there. I feel like that's
Mhm.
a specific word. What exactly do you mean by collage in that sense?
So there's a word in German, it's abgleichen, which just has this idea that I can see like what would it take to make sure that I knew what your red is.
Yeah.
Many of us have these thoughts. We look at the sky and we wonder, how do you see the sky? And as you rightfully pointed out, there's so much variation in your visual system that it's extremely unlikely that we see the sky in the same way. So what would it take? What would it actually take to find out whether or not you're seeing the sky in the same way as I do?
Okay.
And there's a super long story, and I'm very happy to dive in. But I think the upshot of this long story is that the structural account where we start to represent conscious experiences in terms of their structure, or in terms of, better word would be, their mathematics, is this is a very viable, even if not guaranteed, route to be able to do this eventually. And depending on at which research project you look, there's different sets of assumptions. I am willing to say that like the assumptions we're gonna need to do this are very minimal.
Giant news. We created a completely free ebook titled 26 Neuroscience Books for 2026. I've read over 100 neuroscience books in my life, and with Christmas just around the corner, I thought I would help people find the perfect book for them or to buy for someone in their life. It includes really nice science-based illustrations, an accessibility guide, and personally written segments for each book and the impression they left on me. I also asked 100 top scientists like Dr. Mike Levin, Anil Seth, Nick Lane, and many more what their favorite science book is, and you can find all of those included at the end. If you want to support the channel, you can also purchase a beautiful physical paperback copy, also a perfect stocking filler. We put a lot of effort into our first Giant Shoulder product, and we cannot wait to hear your thoughts. Check it out in the link below. Again, it's completely free.